Let me start. Yeah, thank you for having me as a guest of your international series of seminar talks in the IMCC. The title of my talk, Gestures as Temporal Form, formulates a specific take on gesture that I'm advocating. Starting from the idea of gesture as temporal form offers a joint theoretical and methodological approach to the study of multimodal communication. It includes gestures, body movements, and speech, and audiovisual compositions as well. For an exposition of the connection of audiovisuals and gesture studies, I would like to direct your attention to two books, Cinematic Metaphor, Experience, Affectivity, Temporality, and Cinematic Metaphor and Perspective, Reflections on a Transdisciplinary Framework, published in 2018. In Cinematic Metaphor, my film studies collaborator Hermann Kappelhoff and I developed the connection between gesture and film with a focus on theory and methodology of audiovisual compositions, ranging from feature film to news reports. In Cinematic Metaphor and Perspective, international scholars from various disciplines discuss the transdisciplinary framework that we have developed. Contributions include essays from the point of view of applied linguistics by Lynn Cameron, cognitive linguistics, Alan Schenke, media studies, Katrin Fahlenbrach, media history, Michael Wedel, philosophy, Anna Oysterschulte, and psychology, Raymond Gibbs. Further information on the websites of Cinepoetics Institute for Advanced Film Studies and on degruyter.com. In my talk today, however, the focus is on human gestures as temporal forms. Much of what I will be talking about today is presented in more detail in the textbook on gesture and language that I'm about to finish. Should be out, but it's not. So, when looking at the landscape of gesture studies, we see that it is a basic consensus to conceive of gestures as temporal forms. Whether people conceive of gestures as windows on the mind, as visible actions, or as forms of languaging, there is a tacit agreement over one very fundamental issue, namely the connection between the unfolding and segmentation of the gestural movement and the meaning of gestures. In short, this concerns the relation between gestures as temporal forms and the question of how gestures mean. This is what I would like to explore further in my talk today. My lecture falls into three parts: gesture as movement images, gestures as simultaneous and linear forms, gestures and the temporality of discourse. When I speak of gestures as movement images, this refers to the theoretical framing of my view of gesture as a temporal form. Three basic concepts shall illustrate my approach to gesture as temporal form. Adam Kendon's notion of gesture phrases, and with it the segmentation of the gestural movement and its relation to meaning. Helmut Plessner's concept of expressive movements as movement images, and Aristotle's mimesis as an anthropological constant, and how this relates to gesture as mimetic expressive movements. We begin with Kendon's concept of gesture phrases, gesture segmentation and gestural meaning. Adam Kendon proposes a linear segmentation of the gestural movement, which distinguishes three core phases: preparation, stroke, and recovery. This segmentation has been a basic premise of qualitative as well as quantitative research on gesture. Bessem and Ladewig, 2011, offer a nice overview of this issue. Kendon developed this linear segmentation of gestural sequences in the early 1970s. Connecting the analysis of gestural movements with prosodic patterns, he shows that gestures can form simple and complex linear sequences. Simple and small movements go along with smaller prosodic units and with smaller semantic units, whereas larger, more complex movements, including posture shifts, characterize larger prosodic and semantic chunks in an utterance. In short, the basic linear form of gestural movement is the gesture phrase. Gesture phrases can build larger linear forms. These are called gesture units. The borders of the gestural movements are the recovery movements. They mark gesture units or one single gesture phrase. Within gesture units, multiple forms of transitions between gesture phrases are possible. Preparation, stroke, post-stroke hold, and directly to a new stroke, etc. From a pragmatic perspective, the temporal placement of the gesture within the turn determines its organizational function or its sequential meaning. Whether the gesture is coordinated with turn onset or as part of the turn constructional unit or at the transition relevance place is critical for its social function. Moreover, the linear segmentation of the gestural movement is also essential for its semantic meaning. Gestures are semantically underspecified. Their local, contextual meaning depends upon their temporal synchronicity with the linguistic elements of the utterance. This means with the verbal semantics. For example, a gesturally molded rectangle may depict the shape of a sign on the wall or a theoretical frame of a political theory, depending on what is said alongside the gesture. In short, considering the linear segmentation of the gestural movement is of core importance for pragmatic as well as semantic meanings of gestures. In that sense, the temporal form of the gestural movement is essential for gestural meaning constitution. But how about understanding gestures? Are these temporal segments relevant for understanding? Let us revisit Candon once more. Candon bases his analysis of the gesture stroke as the meaningful part of the gesture phrase on Laban movement analysis. Quote, "The phase of the movement excursion closest to its apex is usually recognized as the phase when the expression of the gesture, whatever it may be, is accomplished. It is the phase of the excursion in which the movement dynamics of effort and shape are manifested with greatest clarity. This phase is called the stroke." However, how these gestural units mean remains widely open in the field of gesture studies. Candon's connection of expression and meaning leads us to an academic discourse that offers interesting reflections on how gestures become meaningful expressions and how they are understood. Laban's reflections and practices of dance as expression that Candon refers to are an outcome of a widely led intellectual debate on expressive movement as a social, anthropological, aesthetic, linguistic, and semiotic trait of human behavior carried out in the late 19th and early decades of the 20th century. The idea of body movements as expressive offers an alternative to the idea of expression as an involuntary outer index of a subject's inner disposition. Prominent participants in these debates are Karl Bühler, Psychology and Linguistics, Wilhelm Wundt, Psychology, Helmut Plessner. In Plessner's philosophical anthropology, expressive movements are not goal-oriented actions or expressions of inner states of an individual, but form a behavior that synchronizes an organism with its environment. This synchronization is an effective attunement between bodies, and it is characterized by a certain wholeness, a movement gestalt, a movement image. Plessner illustrates this idea with reference to the movement pattern of a happily barking and jumping dog, but also considers affectless movement forms such as walking, flying, or swimming as wholenesses that form movement images. Here is the quote. "These wholenesses belong to the organism through its relation to the environment, its morphology, its specific instincts as motor categories. As a result, the movement shapes are pictorial, even stretched out over a certain duration of time, are co-present with the observer, grasping, fleeing, repelling, seeking, but also the affectless forms such as walking, flying, swimming represent such movement images. In their temporal unfolding, expressive movements are thus movements of immediately perceived and felt sensations. In this process of perception, they become movement images. An example of a common form of gestural movement image is done by German Chancellor Angela Merkel while giving a speech in the German Bundestag.
Und Sie haben keine Antwort auf die Frage, was man denn tut, um die immer steigenden Lohnzusatzkosten zu vermeiden.
Merkel performs a small but temporally extended gesture that she uses to cautiously outline a succession of rising stairs. It accompanies part of the following utterance. And you have no answer to the question what to do to stop the rising social costs of salaries. The figure shows the exact placement of the gesture in relation to the verbal part of her utterance. Chancellor Merkel forms her hand in a precision grip as if grasping a tiny object, and moves it stepwise upwards with careful, cautious movement dynamics, highlighting each step with a rhythmical beat. The sketch of the gesture's movement path illustrates how an ephemeral staircase emerges in the perception of the audience. The sketching movement itself alone does not make the staircase, just a rising series of little curves. The image of a staircase only emerges in the embodied perception of the audience as a movement image, a time image. To conclude, the historical concept of expressive movement not only details which parts of the gestural movement figurations are meaningful, namely the gesture stroke, but also offers a theoretical frame as to how gestures are understood. The third basic concept of my approach to gesture as temporal form addresses the mimetic dimension of gestures as expressive movements. Aristotle's account of mimesis as anthropological constant serves as an inspiration to systematize gestural mimesis. For Aristotle, mimesis is a fundamental condition of the human species. He develops this notion in his Poetics to distinguish different forms of art. He underlines that the capacity for and the joy of mimesis is what distinguishes the human from the non-human species. In his Poetics, he distinguishes three aspects of mimesis: the means by which means something is being mimed, the objects or what is being mimed, the modes or how mimesis is being achieved. Inspired by the Aristotelian account of mimesis, a systematic for gestural mimesis can be developed that is grounded in the general conditions of mimesis. As means of gestural mimesis, we distinguish different forms of body movement or different bodily articulators and their manifold interplays. Objects of gestural mimesis are actions, shapes, objects, events. In depictive gestures, the hands are used to depict concrete and abstract actions, shapes, objects, events. In pragmatic gestures, the hands enact practical actions to perform concrete communicative actions. Here is an example for a concrete object of gestural mimesis. Former US President Barack Obama uses a gestural enactment of brushing one's teeth when he describes his first night in the White House in an interview in a German late-night show.
The first night that you sleep in the White House.
Yeah.
Because you brush your teeth, you.
The case of a pragmatic object of gestural mimesis is the precision grip gesture. Let's take a look at the video again.
The first night that you sleep in the White House.
Yeah.
Because you brush your teeth, you.
The precision grip gesture, this means the bringing together of finger and thumb as if to pick up a crumb, is an example of a widespread pragmatic gesture. It expresses the preciseness of an argument by transferring the meaning of the practical action to a communicative one. It is the ethologist Desmond Morris who has suggested this etymology and the term precision grip. The precision ring is known as a gesture of public speakers since Quintilian's rhetoric. Obama uses many versions of the precision grip in a typical fashion of political speakers. The one he's using in this example highlights the precise point he wants to make. Namely, sleeping in the White House for the first time is what he experienced as a significant moment when moving into the White House. The moving itself was done by other people. The object of gestural mimesis is the action of as if grasping something very detailed and specific to perform a metacommunicative act. The objects of gestural mimesis can also be abstract ones. Gestures that are used to depict something abstract are quite similar to concrete depictives in that they often enact some practical action, describe the shape, or become a model of some object or event. The difference is that the gesturally depicted actions, objects, events are abstract ones. Here is another example from the Obama interview.
Part of the story of America is this battle between those who want to include more people in this idea of we the people.
An example for an enactment of an abstract concept is the boxing movement that Obama makes when he describes the story of America as being in part a kind of a battle. As he goes on, Obama uses further abstract depictive gestures, metaphoric ones, to illustrate the two contrasting positions clashing in this battle. So when speaking of including more people, he moves his bent arms and hands together and shapes a big circle, almost as if embracing as much space as possible. With this movement, the abstract action of including people is gesturally depicted. This inclusive gesture is followed by the outlining of a sphere, a gestural depiction of the abstract concept of idea. After that, he returns to a smaller version of the embracing gesture, specifying this idea as the inclusive notion of we the people. In short, abstract objects of gestural mimesis are as manifold as concrete ones. Now the third aspect of gestural mimesis, the modes of mimesis. They answer the question of how gestural mimesis is achieved. The hand acts as if performing an everyday action, acting as if pulling a gear shift. The hand acts as if molding some shape, the round shape of a picture frame. The hands act as if drawing some shape or line, the oval shape of a frame. The hand act as if they were a model of some object. Flat hand represents a piece of paper. When revisiting the last Obama example, we see that in this little sequence, he uses two of the four modes of gestural mimesis, acting as if and as if drawing, acting as if boxing, and acting as if embracing, as if drawing the contour of an idea, and then again acting as if embracing. Summary part 1. The meaning of a gesture is connected with its linear unfolding in time. Second, as expressive movements, gestures become movement images in the process of embodied understanding. Third, gestures are mimetic expressive movements. They rest upon the human capacity for mimesis. Part 2, gestures as simultaneous and linear forms. As temporal forms, gestures unfold and vary across simultaneous and linear parameters. I'm going to talk about simultaneous forms or gestural parameters, simple linear forms, cadence gesture phrases, and complex linear forms, cadence gesture units once again. Now, the distinction of simultaneous gestural forms or gestural parameters is inspired by the documentation of signed languages. As signs within signed languages, gesture can be described according to hand shape, movement, orientation, position. Notably, variations with regard to the simultaneous structure of gestures often mark important shifts in meaning. So a detailed look at them is worthwhile. When gestures undergo processes of stabilization, hybrid and fully stabilized forms emerge and may even coexist. The precision grip as a rhetorical gesture that we have seen in the Obama interview is a case of such a hybrid form. While the hand shape shows a stable core, the finger-thumb grasp, all other parameters are variable. This is different for the ring gesture as an expression of excellence and perfection. In this gesture, all parameters are stabilized. Hand shape, finger and thumb form a ring. The movement is accentuated and then held in a post-stroke hold. The orientation is palm vertical, away from body. The position in the gesture space is center, upper periphery. A change of any of those parameters would include a loss of the meaning of excellence and perfection. The ring gesture as expression of perfection and excellence is a classical example of an emblematic gesture, a gesture word, a fully lexicalized gestural form. Jana Bressem has systematized the simultaneous gestural parameters based on an empirical study of recurrent gestural forms of German speakers. This was part of our interdisciplinary research project towards a grammar of gesture, carried out a while ago, funded by Volkswagen. You find the entire systematics on Jana's website as download and in a paper published in our handbook, Body Language Communication. Here you see an overview of recurrent hand shapes, recurrent orientations, positions in the gesture space following McNeil, and different movement parameters. Gestures as temporal forms are structured simultaneously, and I have mentioned it in part 1, they are essentially movements that unfold in time. A consequence of this temporal character is that gestures form linear sequences of more or less complexity. Camden's concept of gesture phrase is such a simple linear form. We have encountered it in Obama's acting as if brushing teeth gesture and also in the preceding precision grip gesture. Both gestures start from a rest position, go through a preparation phase, unfold in a stroke, and then through a phase of recovery, return to a rest position on the lap. Note that even simple gesture phrases can be temporally complex. Angela Merkel's rising stairs gesture is such a case. Now, Camden's systematic also includes complex linear forms, the gesture units. They can entail one or more gesture phrases and may evolve to rather complex linear forms. We have seen such a case of a complex gesture unit already above, and I'll show it once again.
Part of the story of America is this battle between those who want to include more people in this idea of we the people.
Now what we see here is a series of 5 gesture phrases that form one large gesture unit. They form a complex linear form, and note that the brackets indicate that the gesture unit actually continues, and you'll get to see the end of it in part 3. The gray boxes symbolize the gesture phrases. The letters in the boxes are shortcuts for the different phases of the gestural movement. P is preparation, SC stroke continued, SH stroke hold, PR is partial retraction, and the strokes are numbered. We'll return to this complex sequence in more detail in part 3. For now, let me wrap up and summarize part 2. In part 2, we have considered gestures as a temporal form with regard to the unfolding of the gestural movement in time. We have seen that gestures unfold and vary across simultaneous and linear dimensions. With regard to variations in simultaneous parameters, we have seen that they are critical in processes of stabilization of form and meaning. Examples were the hybridity and stability of ring gestures. I have not talked about gesture families, but ring gestures belong to a gesture family in Camden's sense. I can talk more about this if you want in the discussion. Concerning linear forms, we have seen that Camden's gesture phrase is a unit of meaning, and that gesture units may evolve as complex linear sequences of meaning. We will now turn to part 3 and explore further how this flow of gesture phrases contributes to a dynamic flow of meaning in the discourse. Gestures and the temporality of discourse. Here I will illustrate how the temporal flow of gestures contributes to a dynamic flow of meaning by focusing on 3 aspects. Semanticization of the gesture space as a temporal form, foregrounding of meaning as interactive flow of attention, and multimodal stance taking, expressive movements as modulation of affectivity. For the first 2 points, we revisit the Obama interview. Here's the battle video once more, but now you see the complete gesture unit.
You know, part of the story of America is this battle between those who want to include more people in this idea of we the people and broaden our democracy and broaden our economy to give opportunity to all people.
So actually, Obama describes the inclusive idea of America further. What he adds to the story are visions that go along with an inclusive idea of America that he presents verbally and with a series of gesture phrases. When talking about broadening of our democracy and our economy, he performs 2 opening movements with his arms, first a larger, then a smaller one, and ends on the idea of giving opportunity to all people, now repeating the embracing movement in a smaller version. Now, when we consider where in the gesture space the successive gesture phrases are performed, it turns out that they are all performed in the very center of the gesture space. Let's now see what happens when Obama moves on to describe the counterposition.
And those who think, no, those privileges belong to a few people, but not all people.
As he moves on to describe the counterposition to an inclusive idea of America, namely those who think that those privileges belong to a few people, not to all, Obama places these ideas at the left and right periphery of the gesture space. This contrasts with the gestures performed earlier that depict aspects of the inclusive idea of America. All these gestures are made in the center of the gesture space, in front of his upper body. What we see in this sequence of gesture phrases is a linear semanticization of the gesture space. First, the center, and second, and in contrast with it, the peripheral spaces are used to locate and gesturally describe abstract concepts. What we also see in this sequence of gesture phrases is a gestural foregrounding of certain aspects of meaning. This is apparent in the kinds of gestures Obama uses. Let's look at them again and see how the gestures dynamically shift the focus of attention by expressing specific aspects of meaning. The sequence begins with an acting as if holding something, underlining that it is a part of the story he's talking about, followed by the boxing movement that highlights by embodying the notion of battle as a boxing fight. Then the embracing movement that highlights the goal of including more people, followed by the outlining gesture that visualizes the idea as an oval space, and a repetition of the embracing gesture that creates an idea of we the people as a gesture of embrace. The subsequent opening arms movement follow naturally from this embrace. They create an idea of a welcoming embrace and put another central notion of an inclusive idea of America into the focus of attention, broadening the democracy and the economy. As a closure of this complex gesture unit, Obama foregrounds his take-home point, to give opportunity to all people, with a repetition of the embracing and holding gesture. Then he retracts his hands to a rest position on the lap, marking the end of this complex gesture unit that described his inclusive idea of America and his idea of democracy. After a verbal and gestural pause, he sets off for a new gesture unit and gives an account of the counter position. This starts with a locating movement towards his chest, those who think, highlighting that this is the viewpoint of the counter position. The subsequent gestures highlight by enacting a polarized, divided idea of America as a spatial opposition, placing the few people on the left and the excluded part of the society, not to all, on his right side. The Obama example shows how complex gesture units contribute to a temporally motivated dynamic meaning. Here specifically with the semanticization of the gesture space and by foregrounding specific aspects of meaning. The last example I would like to briefly mention comes from a current German-Polish research project funded by the German Science Foundation on multimodal stance taking, expressive movement and effective stance. Here we compare political debates in the German Bundestag and the Polish Sejm. For the analysis of the effective dynamics, we also start from the idea of multimodal expressive movement, but here we focus on the movement qualities. We assume that a particular quality of movement orchestrates affectivity. The Polish team adds to a qualitative analysis of movement qualities an analysis of the prosodic features of those multimodal expressive movement. We look at sequences that show a high affective intensity, and that's what you see in the diagram, and describe them as dynamic temporal form, here as temporal affect images. I'll show you a short video as an illustration. Apologies, it's in German and it's not subtitled yet. This is work in progress, but since this is only about the affectivity, you'll get most of it also when you're not understanding German. I'm pretty sure.
Handeln. Und wenn ich dann höre, meine Damen und Herren, im Haushalt von Hubertus Heil, da würde das Geld zum Fenster rausgeschmissen werden, dann ist das nicht falsch. genug zu problematisieren, weil das Geld, ja, da können Sie lachen, meine Kollegen von der FDP, aber an dieser Stelle den digitalen Strukturwandel zu gestalten, das ist eine Mammutaufgabe. Und die Menschen, die Angst haben, ihren Job durch Digitalisierung zu verlieren, um die müssen wir uns genauso kümmern, wie die Menschen, die Angst haben, durch den Kohleausstieg ihren Job zu verlieren. Und wenn wir uns so um die kümmern, so verächtlich, wie Sie gerade gelacht haben, dann sind das die Nächsten, die die Extremisten wählen werden, meine Damen und Herren.
The speaker is Jens Zimmermann, and he speaks as a member of the Social Democratic Party in a budgetary debate in the German Bundestag. He is a rather fluent and loud speaker, partly reading out and partly speaking freely. But during his 5-minute-long speech, 5:32 to be precise, he engages in some sudden and accentuated beat gestures, accompanied by head nods or upper body beat-like movements and occasional facial expressions, eyebrow lifts, etc. The example that you've seen is only the expressive peak, the moment of the high affective engagement that is at the heart of this expressive movement. The figure shows the short speech, and the colored blocks depict the affective qualities. The movement qualities that constitute the affective qualities can be described as follows. The expressive movement begins with a steady increase of intensity, characterized by speaking faster and louder and accentuated gestural movements. Loud laughter follows, and the affective intensity increases further. The tension increases over some time to eventually explode, being held for quite a while and ending with a short, soft, and accentuated quality. There's no time for a microanalysis of the linear complexities of the gesture units, but what I would like to point out is that apart from an obviously highly effective quality of his bodily performance, and including his voice, obviously, he only uses pragmatic gestures, in contrast to the Obama example. So what is foregrounded here are the pragmatic aspects of his speech. It's not so much about his gesturing, it's not so much about what he talks about, but how. In short, the temporality of gestural forms comes with an inherent affective quality. And this is why I conceive of gestures as expressive movements. Summary. Gesture as temporal form. Part 1 has presented 3 basic concepts of my approach to gesture as temporal form and connected this with Kendon's notion of gesture phrases, Plessner's concept of expressive movements as movement images, and with recourse to Aristotle, I've presented a systematics of gestures as mimetic expressive movements. In part 2, we have considered gestures as a temporal form with regard to the unfolding of the gestural movement in time, and have seen that gestures unfold and vary across simultaneous and linear dimensions, with implications for their meaning. And part 3 has addressed the temporality of gesture on the level of discourse. As examples have served the semanticization of the gesture space, foregrounding, and multimodal stance-taking. Come to the conclusion. The goal of my talk was to substantiate the idea that the meaning of gestures critically depends upon their nature as temporal forms. Now, I've argued that adopting a viewpoint of gesture as temporal form grounds the meaning of gestures in their character as movement images, which unfold in complex ways and that create a dynamic flow of meaning along a discourse. I conclude that gestures are movement images and that they share this property with audiovisuals. At this very end of my talk, I would like to briefly allude to the methodological implications of an approach to gesture as temporal form. A survey of this will appear in the Handbook for Gesture Studies that Alan Schenke is currently editing, and part of it also in the textbook on gesture and language that I'm working on. The figures illustrate the connections between micro and macro structural analysis of gestures. The starting point for all analytic procedures is an analysis of some aspects of the temporal form of gestures. Which analytic aspects are chosen from the toolbox depends upon the research question and the theoretical approach one adopts. An earlier form of the annotation of gesture as temporal form is published in our Handbook on Body Language Communication. You find it there. And so much on the implications of gesture as temporal form for methods of gesture analysis. Now I would like to thank my collaborators, Clara Kindler, Silvia Ladewig, Jana Bressem, and Matthias Roloff for the drawings. And you for your attention. Thank you very much.